Happy New Year, everyone. So welcome to lesson 9 of digital drawing. So today we are going to be looking at Photoshop. So it's the penultimate lesson of the digital drawing course. The week after we have a non-teaching week, but the week after that we'll be finishing with Illustrator, and it will be my colleague Giorgio who will be taking you through Illustrator. Because he's a lot better at it than me, so I'll probably be watching the lesson along with you. But today we're going to be looking at the second Adobe Creative Suite piece of software. After InDesign, we're going to be looking at Photoshop. Today we're going to look at a quick introduction to the workspace of Photoshop. So I can just show you roughly where things are located and give you a brief introduction to the key aspects of the workspace, how it looks and feels. We'll be looking at something called layers, which is an important way in which Photoshop operates. We'll also be looking at how to group layers so that you can keep your drawings nice and navigable and nice and clean. And then we'll be looking at some tools. So there are some main tools that we'll be looking at, and then I'll look into a couple of other aspects of Photoshop. So what we're going to do is, a couple of weeks ago, more than a couple of weeks ago now because of Christmas, but a couple of lessons ago, we created this 3D model of an external facade, a wall, a bench, and some sort of patio. So we're going to use what we created a couple of weeks ago as a PDF in order to Photoshop then. So I'm just going to open this model very quickly, just so if someone didn't export their PDF from Sketchup, then they can do it now. What we did a couple of weeks ago is we opened up our model. We had it in Window Styles. We had it in Hidden Line, which is very important. And we clicked on Profiles, which means that you can see there the difference. When there's a curved line, you don't see the edge. If you tick Profiles and make it 1, that's 1 pixel wide, you can see that the back edge of any curved object is highlighted. Then we went up to camera and created a parallel projection, and then finally camera, standard views, ISO, and there you go. There's an isometric view of your whatever you modeled. I've just clicked this button here, Zoom Extents, to make sure that we capture everything within our view, and then what I did was I export a 2D graphic, and that should allow us to export a PDF. So I'll just put that in the desktop for now. So there are lots of options, but if we go down to PDF here at the bottom and then click on options, and 1.2, that's 1.2 meters. Line scale is 0.25, so that's a nice thin line and a really big drawing. So I'll export that. Make sure that it's on Hidden Line in the default styles. And then the second thing that we did was within the styles dialog box, we clicked on Edit again, and we unticked Profiles and we unticked Edges, and that left us with just the shadow. And then we file, export 2D graphic, and this time we exported JPEG onto our desktop. I'm just going to make it ISO drawing shadow. Just check that's nice and big. That was a 4,000 wide pixel JPEG, which is nice and big, but if yours is not that big, then JPEG options here, if it says 200, 300, something like that, then if you increase it to something around this size, then we'll get a nice big image when we work on that, which will make the quality of the Photoshop object a bit better. So just going to go back to my desktop, And what we're going to do now is we're going to open these into Photoshop, and they're going to be the basis for all of the work that we do. So if I click on my file, it doesn't have to be on the desktop, it can be on any part of the on the computer. Right click and then open with. If you have Photoshop installed, then you can click here and it will allow you to get this import dialog box. So this helps us import a PDF. So you can see that we are cropping to the media box. The width is the width of the PDF itself, so I'm just going to keep it like this for now. 300 dpi, so that's dots per inch. That's a good, that is the number of pixels on an image, so that's a good size. But that means that the image is going to be 14,000 pixels wide, which is quite big for a computer. So I'm going to take that down to 4,000, and that will mean that the file that we have is a more manageable size for your computer, particularly if you have a laptop that's has a lot of work on it from other projects. So if we make it 4,000 pixels, that's still a really good size. And click OK. It will bring us into Photoshop. So we'll leave everything else for now, and I'll use this as my opportunity to introduce the workspace of Photoshop. So I'm just going to push that to one side. So you can see that's how I make that pop out or come back. So this is the workspace for Photoshop. You can see that along the top there are lots of different options. So if I click on the Photoshop box, we have image. So lots of these drop-down boxes. We'll take you through a few of these. Layer, filter. There are lots of these that might be slightly more advanced things to look at, but we'll have a look at a few of them today. Here we have a series of tools. So you can see here there's a move tool. If you hover over the tools, it tells you what each tool is and what it does. Again, if there's a little tool with a tiny little arrow over it, if you hold down, then there are a number of options. We'll look at this tool slightly later. So there are lots of tools down this side. If you hover over, it should tell you how something works and give you a brief description of what it is. And then to the other side, we have our layers. So this is how we manage our drawing. You could see that this is the thing that I pushed back before. So I pushed it back in order to have a bit more space on my screen, but we can bring that back at any time, and we'll be looking at layers quite closely as we go through the drawing. So the first thing to possibly look at in a little bit more detail are layers. When you think of a Photoshop file, in essence what we're doing is it's like having 10 layers of tracing paper or 20 layers of tracing paper, and what you see is you're standing above the tracing paper looking down, and then you're looking at a perfect image with lots of layers. But if you looked at these layers of tracing paper from the side, you would see lots of different layers containing different pieces of information. That's more or less how Photoshop works. So this layer one here are the lines that we imported before. This grey and white little dashed background, that just means no information. So that's a kind of that's a standard pattern that means that information is not there, and it's just used for you to know that there is a piece of blank, paper, for example, in the file. So this is our first layer. This little eye means that it is visible or not, so you can make a layer invisible. This is a little snapshot of what is on the layer. Now, it looks like there's absolutely nothing on the layer, but there are lines there, but they're so thin that we can't see them at the moment. We'll see them in a second. And then here's the name of the layer. If you double click on the name, you can change it. And I would recommend always naming your layers, because if you have a complex drawing, your drawing will, in the end it will have 200, 300, 400 layers, and it will be for individual trees or for people or for bricks or whatever you're putting in your drawing, but you'll have lots and lots and lots of layers. And when you get to the point where you have 200 layers, it's really laborious trying to go through and find a really small piece of information on a layer. So if you name things, it makes it a lot easier. The last things to look at on this little control panel are, we'll go through this in a minute. So with every layer, there's a drop-down list here, and this in essence tells you how you're viewing the layer, so you can do different things with your layers, and that will all become clear in a minute. So it probably makes no sense at the moment, but it will become clear. Opacity, so you can change the opacity of your layer. It's a good thing to know that the more layers you have with opacity that isn't 100, so not a solid layer, the more the bigger your file gets, exponentially bigger. So if you have a lot of layers that are kind of 50% opacity, 90%, 80%, it takes quite a lot of processing power for your computer to be able to deliver that. So they're the key ones, the opacity and the blending mode. Now, in order to create a new layer, you go down here at the bottom, and there's a little plus sign with a button here that says create new layer. So if we click on it, you can see that we have lines and we have layer 1, which is the new layer. So in this new layer, I'm going to flood fill this with some white, just so that we can see what we have. So the way that you flood fill something is you go over here and we have the paint bucket tool. So if you click on the paint bucket tool, you can see we have two colors here. That's just so that you can choose two different colors, and you can flip between the colors. If you want to choose a different color, click on it, and you can go through the entire spectrum here, and you can go from light to dark. So you just click wherever you want, or you can hold down. And if you know the RGB value of a specific color, then you can enter it in here. If you know the hex value, that's another way of defining colors, you can type it in here. So there are lots of different ways of being able to confirm a color. And if you want to produce something that is only for the internet, then you can do this, and this limits the number of colors to colors that are visible on the web. But we're not going to do that today. We're going to remove that, and you can see it gives you infinite possibilities for color. I'm going to go all the way into the top left, which is white, and press OK. So that means we have white as our paint. And then if I click here, I've filled this layer with white. Now, we can't see the lines that we have exported from SketchUp because this layer, which is a solid white layer, is blocking. It's above the layer below. So if we grab a hold of this, just click down and pull, so it's below the lines layer. You can see now, because this layer is below this layer, we can see it. So in essence, when we were talking about the 10 layers or 20 layers of tracing paper, you can imagine if you put a solid white piece of paper on top, you wouldn't be able to see anything else below. Whereas if you pulled that solid white piece of paper to the bottom, then you'd be able to see what was above it. So it's in essence, that's what we're doing here as well. So I'm going to double click on this, and I'm going to call this background and hit enter. So I'm going to stick with naming all of my files, all of my layers properly. So as we go through adding texture and color and different levels of shadow and brightness and things like that to this image, the number of layers will grow, and we'll do different things with each of the layers. The next thing to possibly look at is groups. So we'll talk about groups in a bit more detail later, but if we, for example, on this image, it's quite difficult to see because the lines are so thin, but if we add a brick texture to this wall and a brick texture to this wall and these little sides, then we may have 4 or 5 layers that are all brick. What we can do is we can select all of those together and make them a group, and we'll just call the group brick. And again, if you have 200 or 300 layers, it's a really good idea to start grouping layers so that it's a lot easier to navigate through the layers that you have here. One thing that people might have an issue with is if you open an image, it might actually open black and white instead of color. If that's the case, then you just have to go up to Image, Mode, and make sure that your image is in RGB or CMYK. I tend to go RGB because not many of my drawings are printed, they're all digital. So CMYK are the 4 colors that you have: cyan, magenta, yellow, and I have no idea what that one is. Black, but that's not okay. Anyway, it is it's the printing colors. So if you're going to produce something to be printed, then I'd suggest clicking CMYK, and it just slightly changes the type of color that you're allowed to achieve with your drawing. But I always have mine as RGB. But if your drawing comes in as grey instead of color, then it may be that you have grayscale ticked instead of RGB, or CMYK. So I would say that you just need to make sure that you make sure that you're on the right mode. Right, so I think the first thing to do now, if we've looked at all of this, is to start looking at some tools. So the first tool that we are going to look at is the Move tool. It's nice and simple. Moving, you click on the tool, and then the cursor changes, and you can see here that you click down and it moves. And you'll see here that the only thing that's moved is the background. That's because I'm on the background layer. So if I want to move the lines, click on the lines and then move. So every layer moves separately. And if you want to undo something, you can just Control Z, or you can go Edit, Undo. So they're the 2 ways of undoing. So I'm going to pop that back, and you can see that these pink lines are appearing, which is helping me lock things in place. So a little bit like in InDesign, if I'm moving my lines, that means that it's perfectly centered. You can see there's a vertical line and a horizontal line. Here it's centered on the horizontal, but not the vertical. And here we go, we're back in the middle again. So there are guides that are dynamic guides that can help you locate things in your file. Marquee Tools. So these are things that will help us cut out or copy and paste items slightly later. The first tool that we're going to look at in detail is the Polygonal Lasso tool. So we held it down before, and there were a few different options. There's the Lasso tool, there's the Polygonal Lasso, and there's the Magnetic Lasso. I think when people generally start using Photoshop, they always start using the Magnetic Lasso. Having used Photoshop for 15 years now, I am convinced that this Polygonal Lasso is the best tool. It takes a bit longer to use, but it is far, far better. So that's the tool that we're going to begin with. What we're going to do is we're going to find an image of some timber, and we're going to make this bench appear as a timber bench. So I tend to go through projects doing certain drawings, and every time I find a texture or an image of a material that I think is good. I put it in my computer, so you can see how well organized my computer is. I have a graphics folder, and here we have bricks, lots and lots of bricks. So every time I see a brick pattern that I think is good, or every time I make a brick pattern, I save it in here. Concrete, so every time I find an image of concrete that I think is quite good, I save it here. Same for wood. Every time I see an image of wood that I think is a good quality image, then I save it and I put it in here. So I'm going to go to my wood folder, and obviously I'd recommend you all doing the same. So every time you see an image of a wood that is good, then save it into a folder. The way that we open any file into Photoshop is, again, click on the file, right click, and open with Photoshop. And if you give it a couple of seconds, here you go. Here's the image of the wood. So we're going to click onto the Move tool. I'm going to drag this. So this is the image. And then if I push this over, drag it into this file, you can see I've created a new layer automatically. So this happens automatically. And I have dragged the wood texture into the image that we're working on. You can see I've still got the Move tool selected, so I can move the timber around. So now that we've dragged a new texture in, first thing I'm going to do is double click on the layer and call it wood, so that I know what it is in the future. And you can see there's a little thumbnail of the wood. So it makes navigating slightly easier, because sometimes you're able to see what the thing is. We're going to look at the Scale tool now. So you can either, with the layer selected, go to Edit, and come down to here, Transform, and you can go to Scale. Or you can just go Control T. And Control T will give you lots of options. So it will scale, rotate. There are lots of things that you can do. So I'm going to go back to the original one to begin with. So Edit, Transform, Scale. You'll see when we click on Scale, this top bar changes. So this tells me how many pixels wide the image is. Currently it's at 100% width and height. That's because it's the original width and height, and it's at 0 angle. So what you can do is you can either, I'm just going to press Control minus to zoom out, Control minus. You can either just hover over one of these little squares and click down, and it will shrink proportionately. If you want it to shrink and not stay with the original proportions, you can hold down Shift, which is the up arrow on the left of your keyboard, and that will allow you, give you freedom to stretch it and pull it. But if you don't hold the Shift arrow down, it will just scale proportionately. And I'm going to pull it down until it just covers the bench. Don't have to be too accurate about that. And then hit Enter when I'm happy with the scale, and I've just typed Control plus to zoom in, Control plus to zoom in, Control minus to zoom out. Now this is where we can look at the blending options. So you can see at the moment the wood is above the lines. So if I pull the wood below the lines, you can see the wood is now visible below the lines. If I push this above, the wood is not visible. Sorry, the lines are not visible below the wood, because the wood is a solid layer. There are a couple of things we can do. We can change the opacity. So we can, if we pull that down, you can start to see the lines below the wood, but you lose the quality of the timber. So we want the timber to be 100%. Instead of changing the opacity, you can change how we blend the layer. So at the moment it's normal. This is dissolve, doesn't really do anything. Darken doesn't do anything. Multiply. So multiply is when it's difficult to explain this without just using the word multiply, but you multiply the original image with whatever is behind the image. So it's quite a useful tool. I think we'll use multiply relatively frequently. Color burn. What I will often do is just go through these and see what the effect is with some of these options. So you can see here, difference has made it black and white. Exclusion has changed the relationship with the lines. So there are lots of different options, but multiply is the one that we're going to use now because I want to have the brilliance of the timber as it is at the moment, and I want to see the lines. Obviously the alternative is to just pull the lines above. In that instance we can have it normal and we can just have the lines above. So I have rescaled the wood and it's now over this line that I want to be the bench. This is where we're able to use the Lasso tool. If we hold down here, Polygonal Lasso, I say it's the best one, but if we just look at what this tool does, it gives you the chance to try and cut out, but you have to hold down with your mouse. And it's very difficult to try and follow that line. So that was really unsuccessful. So I'm just going to press Command D or Control D on a PC, which is deselect. You can also go Edit, Deselect, wherever when you're holding it. So Lasso is not a very useful tool. Magnetic Lasso allows you to hover over a line, click, and then it should try and stay with, so this is where Photoshop just kind of uses a bit of its brains to try and follow the line that you have told it to, but be a bit cleverer. And you can also click every time there's a hard corner. But you can see there are corners where it's not very accurate. So it's not the best. Actually, when you want to get super accurate, you have to click the line yourself. So you can see here, if I just did that, see how inaccurate it is. It's not very good. So I'm just going to come back and then click. What we've done is we've created a selection area, but it's not very good. So I'm going to Command D, which is deselect, and I'm going to go for the tool that is the one that we actually want to use, which is Polygonal Lasso. And that means that we have to do every click ourselves. So it's the most manual option of all of the lassos, but it's the one that works the best. So you click once to start using it. You can just push your mouse down into the corner and the screen will move for you. Click, and we just literally have to go around and click every time we want to tell Photoshop where to put a line. So there are a few ways we can do it. We can do it like this, where we click around every line, or click, click. And then when you want to close a shape, you can just double click and it will close. So it will just kind of draw a straight line from wherever you are to where you started. So if you see up at the top, we've been drawing our lasso with add to selection, but the original is that every time you start drawing again, it gets rid of the old thing and starts with a new thing. That's not what we want. There's one way you can add, which is up here. That means that you do that and it just adds to the original selection. Control Z, I don't want to do that, Command Z. This I want to remove from the original selection. So I've done my line and then I'm just going to start removing these bits so that we're left with just the outline of the bench. Now, you can add wood texture in SketchUp. You definitely can. But like I said, from experience, and if you look at all of the visuals that students are developing in the master's course, or if you look at the visuals that architecture practices create, they are nearly all done this slightly more manual way. So we've drawn around the bench, and we have this moving line, which means that something has been selected. There are a few things we can do now. We can right-click on the shape, and we can do layer via copy. We click on that. I'm just going to use this little visual eye tool to make the original wood, not visible. You see that what's happened is that the thing that we created via a copy has stayed there, which is really good. I'm going to Control Z because that's one way of doing it. And then obviously you can either just delete this layer or keep it. That's one way of doing it. And if you Control Z twice, it goes back 2 steps. So I think it's there's an unlimited number of Command Zs, I think. So you can go back quite far if you've made an error. Another way that we can do it is on our shape that we've drawn. We can right-click and we can select inverse. So instead of selecting the bench, now we're selecting everything other than the bench, and we can press delete, and that would delete everything that was selected. Again, we've got the same result, but we haven't created a new layer. We've just deleted everything that we didn't want. Control Z, because there is another option. Control Z twice then, so instead of selecting the inverse, again we're selecting the bench. This is to create a mask. So masks are relatively complex, and like I said, I've been using Photoshop for maybe 15 years, but I've been using masks for 1 or 2, and they have completely changed how I use Photoshop. So when you have the layer selected, what you do is you come down here to the bottom, and there's a little button here which is Add Layer Mask. So if you click on that, you'll see that everything has disappeared, but the beauty is that it's still there. And that's because if you look here, we've added a layer mask. Now everything that is black is hidden, and where it's white, it remains visible. And you can see right now, if we go up to move and move this, the wood moves. So Control Z, so it goes back in place. But if we click on this little lock, this little chain, now what you can do, if we click on here, you can move the wood, but we've kept the mask in place. So it's really helpful, because if we opened another texture, let's say we open another wood, let's go back here, and I'm going to go down here and open this one, plywood. Here it is. So if I just open this, what I can do is I can right-click on my mask, add mask to selection, and then click on my new plywood, click here, and you can see that now, if I unlock it, now it's a plywood mask instead. So it's a plywood bench instead of a kind of oak bench. So this mask is quite useful. You can move the mask. I need to click on this mask. You can move the mask, but the wood stays in place. So it means that it gives you an extra level of control over the drawing. I'm going to keep that hidden. I'm going to call this one bench oak, and then I'm going to call this one bench plywood. So there is my first item cut out. When we exported the lines, we also exported these shadows. So I think that now we can open these shadows and add those into the drawing. So again, right click, open with Photoshop. And obviously it goes without saying that all of the things that we're looking at now can be used for drawings such as elevations, sections, plans, other types of architectural drawing. So we're going to pull this down from here and then pull it into the drawing, and you can see that the shadow, let me just call it shadows, is almost the same size as the drawing behind. Because the shadow is selected, I can just use the arrows at the bottom of my keyboard to move the drawing along. But you can see that it's just ever so slightly too big. You can see down at this side it needs to be changed in scale. But you can see why we've added the shadows the way we have, because it improves the image, improves the quality of the drawing. So we're going to change the scale of the shadow. This is a bit of a kind of tricky job, but it's worth it. So we edit, transform, scale. Now that we have the scale here, I'm just going to hide this so that we've got more visibility. You just have to pull this and keep pulling the two until it looks as though they overlap perfectly, which it looks as though they are here. There you go. So that's my shadow fitted to the background. What I always do is just make a little note of this. So my notebook is just full of random percentages, because you never know if you have to import the shadow again. It's good to just know that 98.84 is the size, and it means that in the future you're able to just type in those numbers instead of playing around with it. If you're happy with it, hit enter. And now if we zoom in, we've got shadows, there you go, on top of our drawing. Click on my layers again. This is where the multiply, the blending options really come in, because we have, I'm just going to make this invisible for a second, we have a bench here that we want to have full the brilliance of the texture, and we have a shadow here that we want to overlay on top of everything that we've done. This is where we make it visible. Instead of having it as normal, we go down and we make it multiply. And then you can see here that the vibrance of the wood has been retained, but we've also got the full depth of color of the shadow. So that's where using the multiply tool is really useful. So I'm just going to save that as a matter of good housekeeping. Just going to save that there. File save as a PSD. So we've looked at some of these blending options. Multiply is normally the one that is most useful, but if we just look at color burn, see what happens there. All of the everything that was kind of on white has vanished, but you can see the bench still has a little bit of a remnant of the shadow. Linear burn is a bit different to the multiply. It looks as though the wood has more vibrance, so maybe that looks better. You can go through and choose what is best for you. Lighten, color dodge, overlay. Some of these are not very useful, so it looks as though it's between linear burn and multiply. I'm going to go linear burn today. So we've done the bench. Now what we're going to do is bring in another material, and we're going to do some concrete. So that's the wrong one. Concrete, here we go. And I'm going to open this image of concrete. Let's see if it looks any good. It's got these lines on it, so I might not use that one. I may use this one instead. So I'm going to open that with Photoshop. Here we go, we have an image of concrete. So I'm going to pull this down, pull it across. You can see here that we have an image of concrete. It's more or less the right size, which is good. But I'm going to show you how to use, I'm just going to call this concrete, and I'm going to show you how to use a group now. So you can see this is quite a good scale for the size of image. If I Control T for Edit, Transform, Scale, you can see that if I make it too big, it starts to get a bit pixelated, and I don't really want that. So I liked the scale that it came in at. It looked like a good type of pixelation, but it's not big enough to cover this lintel and this lintel here. These are both concrete things. So I'm going to make a group. So the first thing I'm going to do is right click and make group from layers. And it's going to be called concrete lintels. Now you can see here that there's a little folder icon, and our layer is now here. So I can right click, duplicate layer. Okay, now we've got two. Now we've got two of these concrete layers. So I can close the folder, I can close the group, I can make both of them invisible at the same time, and I can create a layer mask for both of them, which is really useful. So what I'm going to do is Control plus, zoom in, get my Polygonal Lasso, and draw around both of these. There is one other way of just nudging that with my cursor and then double click to end. There is one other way of selecting something, but again, I don't think it's quite. You can see here that there's a little minus next to my lasso, which shows that I'm on a subtract option. So I'm just going to go over to the top and click plus instead, and you can see that it's turned into a plus, which means that if I carry on clicking now, it will add this selection to the original selection. And I'm going to come down and click. So that's the shape. Control minus just to zoom out. That's where I want my concrete, and now that I've got it selected, I can just press mask, create layer mask. And the beauty is that everything within this group, I can add anything into this group now, is subject to that layer mask. So I'm just going to add this concrete. I'm going to open it in Photoshop, pull it across, drop it in. I've dropped it into my group, and you can see that it's just appeared, but it's all being affected by the same layer mask. If you want to, for whatever reason, remove the layer mask for a minute, you can right click and disable it. So you'll see what is behind the mask, and then if you just click on it again, it will reappear. I'm going to make that invisible and call it scratch concrete. So there is a concrete lintel and a wooden bench. The next thing I'm going to do is to look at some brick. So again, I have a folder full of bricks that I have found that I think are good. One good place to find bricks is a website called Peterson Tegel. If you click on that and go onto the website, they have really beautiful bricks, which is the kind of most important thing. But they also, if you go on products and then bricks, you can choose a brick color. I'm going to go to this one. And if you go to references, texture, you can download the texture. And here it is. So they give you a seamless texture, which means that you can push them up against each other and you don't see the join. You have different mortar options, so one with dark mortar, one with light mortar, and then they give you this as well, which is a mask for the mortar which you can use. But you go on there, there's lots of different brick options, and I'm just going to open that in Photoshop and pull that across and drop that in. So you can see here that we now have a brick texture. Just going to call that, I'm going to make that a group actually, so I'm going to right click, group from layers, bricks, and here's bricks 1. So another thing that is good with layers, with groups, sorry, is that you can make the group multiply, and everything within it does not multiply within itself. That's a bit of a kind of complex thing to get your head around, but the more you use Photoshop, the more useful the idea of multiplying a group will be, as opposed to just multiplying individual layers. But I'm going to multiply the group, and then here's my layer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to push the brick up to the line, and then we can use a tool called Distort to change the size. So the first thing I'm going to do is Control T, or that's a free transform. We go transform scale, and I'm going to pull this up so that it is the right size. Here we go. So it is the right size, and now if we go Edit, Transform, Distort, you can hold any of these points, and you can see you can pull it across. So again, you can flood fill a texture in Photoshop, and then obviously you can see here you can pull individual points. So you can flood fill a texture in Sketchup, sorry, but you have a lot more control over the texture, the quality of the image, if you do it in Photoshop yourself. So when you're happy with it, hit enter. Now if I Control 0, that just pulls me out to the maximum extent of the image. So it's like a kind of a bigger Control Z. Maybe the linear burn, I'm going to see what multiply looks like instead. Maybe still linear burn looks better. Maybe what I'll do is linear burn, and I'll make it a little bit less opaque, so 75% opacity instead. So you can see that we have some bricks, and we have the concrete here, bricks here, and the bench is there. And maybe the last thing that I'm going to look at the moment is to add another concrete here to the patio. So I'm going to go into my concrete folder. Where is it? Concrete. And we're going to choose a different type of concrete. We're going to choose this one. Open with Photoshop. I'm going to pull it across, drop it in, and then I'm going to pull it down. I'm going to multiply it. So you can see, look, the size of those holes is really big, which means the scale of the image isn't correct. So it's really important when you're doing an image like this that the scale of the photograph is roughly correct, so it doesn't look strange. So I'm just going to zoom out, Control T, which is transform, and then I'm just going to pull this so that it is a bit smaller, so it looks a bit more appropriate for our drawing. That looks better. I can even pull it so far that you don't really see those kind of the big holes that I'm not too happy with. Now that we've got this roughly in the right scale, if we go back to our lines, there's another way of selecting that we can use, and it's this tool here. It's the magic wand. So if we click on that, you can click, and it will Photoshop will see lines. You can see here that there's a magic wand with a plus underneath it, so you can see that I've got the add selection. So we can just add areas that we think are important. And that's really good when we come to things like this chair, because you can see how complex it is. It would be a bit of a pain clicking around every single line. I still do it all the time, but sometimes it's easier to use the magic tool and magic wand, and we can just click around areas where we think the concrete should be. And then when we're done, just going to zoom out and we can do the mask layer again. So we can go back to our concrete here, make sure that we're on the right layer, click mask, and there you go. We have a concrete patio. I'm just going to call that patio so that we know what it is. Now there are a few little tricks. We can make the lines invisible. You can imagine if you carried on adding all of these layers, then it would start to make the drawing look render-like, which is quite nice. We can start to do things like if we make this bench a group. So I'm going to group from layers. Okay, now that we have the group, I'm going to delete this one because it's kind of getting in the way. This is one step up in terms of complexity from just putting a mask on an individual layer. You can actually grab the mask because we've unlocked it. You can actually grab it and assign it to the group instead of just this layer. If we right click, we can duplicate. So it means that now we have two. Control D. Sorry, I had a magic wand selected instead of move. So what we could do now, you can see here we've got two wood layers, got these both, but they're both underneath the same mask, which is great. I can control T, which is transform, and I can rotate one of these layers. I'm just going to zoom out. So you can see I'm rotating one of them, and if I move it up, it means that we can start to get quite accurate with how the wood would appear on the bench. So you can see if I do that and click enter, now the wood on top is at a slightly different angle to the wood below, which is quite good because it means that it looks a bit more realistic. Although this bit is annoying me a bit because that wouldn't happen, so I'm just going to get my Polygonal Lasso. I'm just going to click here, double click, and then delete. I'm just going to delete that bit of wood from the top one. Now you see if I remove the lines from the drawing now, it's starting to look even more accurate, and I think that if you can start to do things like that in your drawing, then I think that it benefits your drawing generally. If you're not quite happy with the tone or brightness of a material, then there are a few things we can do to that. With the thing that you're unhappy with or you want to change selected, you can go to Image Adjustments. You can see there are lots of different types of adjustments here, but the ones that are most helpful are brightness and contrast. So if you click on that, you can see you can make something brighter or darker. It's quite useful. I'm going to put that back to 0. I'm quite happy with the brightness of it, but you can change the contrast. So you can see here, you can make the darker darker and the lighter lighter, or you can reduce the contrast. That looks quite good as well. You can change the hue and saturation, which is another really useful one. So hue saturation, you can see if you pull this across, you can make the whatever image you have. It was yellowish to begin with, a kind of peachy yellow. You can change the color of it to pink all the way through the spectrum, blue. I'm going to leave it at this greeny thing for now. You can change the saturation, so you can make it quite grey, or you can make it super vibrant. And you can change it so that it's light or dark. So you can see that you have almost total control over how a texture or an image appears. One thing that is quite useful sometimes, if I think that this concrete, for example, here, is a bit too light in tone to match the tone that I want, which is something that complements this brick, this warm brick and this warm wood, you can go to your concrete here, and you can go adjustments. Sorry, if I click on the concrete, image adjustments and photo filter, and you can see here that you can apply some filters to your concrete. So this is at 25%. I would say that's a bit too high. So if you go down to kind of around 5, you can go through these. You can see how it just slightly changes the warmth, or you can make something slightly cooler, or you can make something slightly redder. But there are ways in which you can affect the colour of a texture in a slightly more interesting way, rather than just playing with the saturation. So maybe that is quite it's quite a subtle change. You can see here that's because it's at 5%. If we increase it to 10, then you can see that it's starting to, it's a slightly different color to the original. And if we increase it to 15, you can see that it's changing color completely. So that's quite a useful tool to be able to use as well. And then in terms of other tools that I think are quite useful, this is an issue for me. This big black mark there, it kind of changes the perceived scale of this of the patio. So I'm going to go to the patio here, and there are a few ways that we can amend that. We can use the Smudge Tool here. So if I just click that, you can just smudge a layer. So you can see I've just kind of literally smudged it. You can see that it's not the most accurate, it's not the most subtle way of doing it, so I'm just going to Control Z that. You can change the size of the smudge. If you click that there, so you can see it's gone quite small now, so I'm kind of smudging it over. That's helped a bit. Control Z lots of times so I can show you some other options. There's a blur tool as well, so if we hold down, there's a blur tool which you can use here that you can see blurs the thing, but that's not really helping either, so I'm going to Control Z. There's one more tool that I think is useful to look at the moment, and that is the clone stamp tool, which is here. So the clone stamp, the first thing you have to do is if you hold down Option, you select the point at which you want to clone, and then you just draw, and you can see the cross is where the image is copying from, and the circle is what you're drawing over. So it allows you to clone something. So again, you click on Clone Stamp, and then you hit Option, and that's where you select the point at which you want to copy from in the patio. Obviously we're at 14, but we could make it bigger. There you go. Option, and then we just draw, and it clones from the original image. So you can see I can actually go over, and every time there's something that I'm not happy with, these bigger black marks, I can just copy over. There you go. So the clone stamp tool is quite a useful tool to use as well. There's one last thing that I'm going to look at, and that is using PNG files. So there are plants and people are two good things to be able to insert into a drawing. So these are images that I have from, again, that I've downloaded myself. So I'm going to open this, which is, I'll choose a different one. So I'm going to open this, open with Photoshop. So this is a tree, obviously, and you can see it's .png, which means that it retains see-through information. If you save something as a JPEG and it's see-through, it will save white, but a PNG will retain transparency. So if we put this over now, it's going to be really big, but if I pull it up towards the top and I Control T, means I can change the scale. So I'm just going to make it really big and pull it over, and I can add tree to the drawing, and maybe add the tree there. I'm just going to, you can either erase, so there's an eraser here. Just need to find it. There it is, eraser tool. So you can just erase something. You can see here that the opacity is 10%, so that means that it's only a 10% effective rubber. If you turn that up to 100, you can make that stronger eraser. So there's my tree. Now a trick is to group this. Create a group. I'm going to call the group tree. And if we copy the tree over, so now we have two trees, see here, but we go to Image Adjustments, Hue Saturation, pull this down so it's completely black, and then change the opacity so that it's very light, let's say 10%. You can actually create a tree shadow, and then we're just going to use the Lasso tool to draw around there. Click and delete and deselect. So you can see here that I've created a tree shadow just from using the tree itself, and that's where having something grouped is really helpful, because I can move those two along together. And if you want them to stay together forever, you can select both of them. That's by clicking one and then holding down Option or Control or Command and clicking the other one. Right click, you can link the layers. You can see now that these two are linked. So if you move one, the other one will always move with it. That's one option for something to drop in. And the other thing that is really good is people. So you can see here I've selected and downloaded some people that I think are quite good. A good website for that is Sketchup. And it is cutout people, and they're all free. So you just go here and then choose some people as a person with some shopping, and then you just save it, and you can use it, and it keeps the see-through image. But you can see here I've got a couple that are quite useful and quite good. Open with Photoshop, and then if I drop this person in, I can have somebody. Let's just make she's a giant at the moment, so I'm just going to make sure she's at the right scale. She's still really big. That's probably correct. Again, it's, like I said, it's really important that you make sure that these things are at the right scale. I'm just going to I might make a group called people. So you can either right click and group from layers, or a shortcut is to just press Command G or Control G and then people. And now you can see this is where I'll put all of my people. So that is a brief introduction to using Photoshop. Hopefully you understand that the principle is to apply textures to layers. You can change the brightness and contrast of layers, so you can make something darker or lighter. You can have almost infinite control over each of these layers. Everything is visible according to what order it's in. So if I pull the tree below everything else, suddenly it's not visible. If I pull it towards the top, then it's completely visible. If I want to have it below some shadows, then I pull it below the shadows. We can change how something is viewed or blended. We can use the magic wand and the Polygonal Lasso as two really useful tools. The Marquee Tool is the other way of selecting an area. Obviously, this way it's just very simple shapes, but you can select something circular or rectilinear using that method. The Paint bucket tool and the clone stamp tool are also very useful. But hopefully using those tools you'll be able to save and develop texture drawings, color drawings, elevations, plans, sections, and drawings like this to go into your portfolio.